Welcome back, writers, to video number 2. This time we're going to be talking about the what of memoir. What is memoir and what you should include and not include in your manuscript as you begin to produce material. Before we do that, I just want to remind you that you have a workbook, a PDF that came along with this package. And from the previous video, I suggested some journaling. You're going to find those journal questions on page 5. And then the material that we'll be talking about today will also be in your workbook, and we will be especially discussing the ARC timeline, and it's on page 8, all right? So let's get started. I'm just going to share my screen with you here. Great. So the question is, what is your story about? I'm just going to start us off with a definition of memoir here, because I think that's going to be helpful as we move forward. A memoir is not an autobiography, okay? It's not where you write, I was born at this point and, well, you don't know when you're going to die if you're watching this video. But it is essentially, it's not a story of your whole life, all right? What a memoir is, it's a personal story. And it usually is time limited. So it's some portion of your life, or it covers some theme in your life, some particular issue that is revisited time after time, and you want to write about that theme in your life, all right? And so a memoir is written from first-person perspective, which is to say that you're going to be using the word I a lot. And when you write a memoir, the I is the point of view, so you really can't write scenes where you're not there. You know what I'm saying? Like it needs to be a scene written from the perspective of the narrator, which would be you. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that you can't write a scene that you're not a part of, but you will need to write it as told to you. So everything that happens in a memoir happens from the perspective of this narrator, you. And that can be both very limiting and very freeing. So it's limiting in the sense that you don't get to jump into other people's heads. You don't get to take the reader, to another part of the country where the narrator has never been. Unless you're doing something really stylistic, you will need to stay put inside the head of the narrator. But what can be really freeing about that is that it's your perspective, okay? This is your story. You're writing what happened to you from your understanding of it and the meaning that you are making of it. So it's freeing in the sense that this is all about your voice, okay? You get to say what you want to say regardless of what other people may think about it or how they saw the series of events. All right, so the second thing I want to talk about here with regard to what is a memoir is that memoir is narrative writing, which means that it's a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, a narrative arc, which we'll talk about today. There will be characters, there will be a setting. It's going to take place somewhere or several places. And it's most closely linked in genre to the novel, okay? So the novel, as you know, when you sit down and you read a novel, it's a continuous story or a series of stories that come together and create one through narrative, okay? The memoir is the same thing. So if you are working on a novel, you're going to be basically developing the same set of skills as with a memoir. So those of you who are novelists, you probably been working on the same set of skills all along. All right, so a good memoir has a quest that the narrator goes on. And a good quest will include two things. One thing is a story. Something needs to happen that's worth telling. If the thing that happens isn't worth telling, you're probably not going to be thinking about writing it anyway, right? And the other thing that a good memoir will have in the quest of the narrator is a question, okay, that is being explored, or a theme that you want to tackle. So, for example, in the story Wild by Cheryl Strayed, the story was of a young woman who took a hike on on this long trail. Okay, but the theme she was exploring was grief. So, really, throughout the whole story, even though all kinds of things happen on the trail, she encounters interesting characters. She's exploring this question of grief and how to let go of her mother and all of the things that she's lost in the course of her life, right? So that's a great example of a good memoir where both of those things happen. Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt, another great example where the story is of a childhood that happens in Ireland, and the question or the theme being explored would be, well, there would be several, usually there will be a few, would be loss and poverty and family. You know, these are the themes or the questions that the story is looking at, okay? So I keep using this word arc, and let's just talk about what that means so that you and I are on the same page, okay? So usually a story arc in a novel or in a memoir is going to start out with, you know, some setting of the scene, and then there'll be a conflict or a question or a crisis or something that sparks the story. And then in the process of telling the story, you're going to want to build up tension so that the reader is invested in what's going on for the narrator. You know, the stakes need to be high for some reason. And then at some point, the narrator, this is in the case of a memoir, the narrator is going to get some epiphanies, or some things are going to start to come together. You understand? So that she or he can put the puzzle pieces into place. Oh, this is what I need to learn. This is how I'm going to resolve this conflict. And then all of the what we call the denouement, which is the downward cycle of the action, where things begin to get resolved. You know, the consequences of having lived a lie will start to unfold, and these decisions need to be made, and you know, you start to throw off the things that encumbered you in the story. Now, it's the same in a novel. Although in a novel, there may be several characters that you're focusing on. There may not just be one main character whose conflict needs to come to completion. Whereas with a memoir, usually the narrator's conflict is the one that we're focused on. So this still may not be totally clear to you, but don't worry, because we're going to talk about how it applies to your story in particular in a moment, all right? Now, what I want to point out is that it's not always as simple as that, you know, half circle arc that I showed you in the last picture. Very often with a book length project, you're going to have the opening scene, and there will be several little crises along the way until about 2/3 of the way through the material, there will be the climax. You know, everything comes to a head. The lie is found out. The epiphany happens. You decide, I can't do this anymore, and you walk out the door. So, and then there is the sliding down or the resolution of the material. So I don't want you to have the idea that it's just as simple as 1, 2, 3, right? You might have several storylines going through the material. That's totally fine. But just to simplify things for the sake of this initial conversation, I want to show you how to work with the story arc in a few minutes. And I want to let you know that as you begin to write, you're going to obviously see additional stories, or, you know, backstories that need to come into play, or maybe your mother's history needs to come into play. So in that sense, you totally can write about things where you weren't present, but you can't write about them from inside the heads of other people, because the narrator is the vehicle through which we see the story told. All right, so let's just talk about a few things that happen ideally in a memoir. The story itself needs to have some tension to it. So a lot of times with travel writers who come to me to get some support in their material, they'll say, "Oh, I had this amazing trip and I really want to write about it." And I'm all about that. I'm a travel writer. I love to take my readers to various places around the world, and that's lovely. And there needs to be some tension in the story. So either some trouble the narrator gets into, or some question that she's grappling with, or some conflict in the family. So there needs to be some tension, not in every moment, but in the story as a whole. And if that's not there, what you may have is not a book length project, but perhaps a blog entry or an article or something like that. There's a lot of other places where you can write about a place or even an event that doesn't have much tension in it. So never fear, there's always a place for what you're working on. So here's the example that I have is, is she going to make it to the train that's going to lead her to the love of her life? So we have this whole, location where she's telling us, perhaps the narrator is telling us all about, Japan in the case of the story that I'm writing right now, and the smell of it and the feel of it and, the description of the buildings and all of this stuff. But where's the tension? It's in what's happening for the narrator. So also in a memoir, ideally the main character, which would be you, is holding the internal tension with the question that's being explored. So there's not only the external tension of the story, oh, is she going to make it to the train? But the internal question as well, which could be something like, will she finally learn that she has the power to make her own decisions? So what I'm trying to point out here is that there is the story and the theme, always the story and the theme, the scene and the question. And these two elements need to go side by side in the memoir. There should also be a universal question that's being explored through the events. And I have some funky punctuation there. So will we as readers learn, grow, question, wonder from our narrator's journey? All right. And I think this is something that when you first get started, you may not need to worry about, but the further into your revisions that you get, you definitely want to explore, how does my story connect with my reader? So my example here might be something like, is there a conflict between love and personal power in the example that I'm working with here from the first 2 points? Okay, so the personal question is, will the narrator experience her own personal power? The second question is more universal. Is there a conflict in this in general? And the really great memoirs of the world take into account both the story of the narrator, like in Wild, Cheryl Strayed is really dealing with the issue of her own grief, but she is also very much dealing with the question of grief, period. And so every reader who comes to this book walks away totally connected to her own grief, even though she's reading about the grief of the narrator on the page. So let's just stop and consider what your story is, okay? In other words, what happened that you want to show the reader? So just take a second, turn off the video, and give yourself a moment to journal. What is your story about? What are you really wanting to tell? Okay, just take a moment to do that. The next question I would have you explore is, what are the takeaways? How does your story explore a universal question? So what I like to coach my writers that I work with individually to do is to sort of step back, close their eyes, and I actually do this exercise with them. So close your eyes, think about yourself standing in front of a group of people, and they all have your book in their hands. All right. This is a few years down the road. You've written your book, it's been published. Maybe you can even see the cover of the book. Okay, now you're there not to give a reading from your book, but you're there to talk about what you learned from what happened to you or from what you did. So, whatever the story is, you're there to talk about maybe the top 3 things that you learned from this journey. And if you were to sit down and write what those are to get ready for this talk, what would they be? So, open your eyes. Look down at your piece of paper, turn off the video again, and do a little journaling. What sort of takeaways or questions does your story explore if you were to give a speech or a TED Talk, for example, from what happened to you? So just take a minute to do that. All right, so let's get to the nitty-gritty here. This is actually a screenshot from a worksheet that I use with my writers, and it is here in your memoir workbook, okay? So basically, what I'm going to recommend that you do is that you take this piece of paper where you've been journaling, turn it over, and turn it so that it's landscape, like this example here, and draw an arc, okay? On the far left-hand side of the arc, like you can see on the screen here, I want you to write the date where your story begins. So if your story begins with an argument that you had with your spouse, for example, I want you to write the date and give that scene a name. So my example here is that, and this is a made-up example. I got off the plane in Africa and George was nowhere to be found. So if this were my actual memoir, I would write the date and I might give this scene a name like No George at Airport. Something so you can remember it jogs your memory, what that scene is going to be about. Okay. At the far right-hand side of your arc, I want you to write the date where you think the story ends. Now, I'm recommending you do this chronologically, even though you may not ultimately end up writing your story chronologically. And the reason is because I want you to be able to have all of the events, all of the scenes that you want to include in the book right here. Okay? So let's say that the story ends, in my example, I've written, I ditched George. So the end of the story is that I don't get together with George at all, and I break up with him. Okay, so give that last scene a name as well. Now, in between, I want you to go through and make a list of all of the scenes you know you need to put in your book. And the reason I'm asking you to think of this exercise in terms of scenes is because I want to get you started to think like an author. An author needs to bring to life the who and the where and the what and the how and the why of the story. And it starts with scenic depiction. So a lot of times beginning authors, what they'll do is they will just write about all their feelings, and they'll sort of tell a general story. Like they might say, I got off the plane, I looked around the airport, and I couldn't find George, and I was mad. Okay, that's a great start. But the fact is that I really want to build a scene out of this. I want to get off the airplane. I want to look around and notice that the walls are made of cement and that it's an open air terminal. Okay. I want to notice the smell in the air of burning garbage on the outskirts of the city. I want to notice the colorful dress of some people in the airport. I want to feel the sweat on my skin. I want the fatigue in my body to really come forward after this long flight. And I want to describe the panic that starts to happen when I look everywhere that I think George ought to be. Where do I look? Well, maybe I look at the baggage claim. He's not there. So I go to the information desk. Has anybody asked for a blonde woman? No. So I really want to build the scene and flesh out every detail of it, taking the reader moment by moment through the experience of the narrator. Okay? So that's why I want you to begin to name the scenes that will jog your memory to the details that you're going to write about. And when I work with writers individually, I'm really working on this skill of building scenes. It's not something that comes naturally to most of us unless we've been writing for a long time or we've done a lot of work in the theater or in film. So don't distress when you sit down to write and you're like, I don't know what to say. At least you're going to get started, even if it's with a shallow description of the scene, because you're going to have this list. So chronologically go through, the life of the story that you want to tell, put the dates down in order, and then give each scene a name. So that's great. You've got the scenes. Now you're going to have a list of them. And remember I said that there's two pieces. There's always the scene and the theme. There's the story and the question. So if you've done all of the scenes in one color on the top part of the arc, what I want to suggest is that you then, in another color pen, whatever, I have red and blue here, but you can use green and purple. For each scene, I want you to sort of ask yourself, what might I be exploring? What might be the theme or the struggle that I'm exploring in this scene? And you might not come up with something for every single one of them. My examples are here, I get off the plane and George isn't there. It's a realization that I'm alone in a foreign land and I'm going to have to face my lifelong fear of being alone. Okay. So as soon as I set that up in the first scene, I know that this book is going to be about this trip to Africa, yes, but it's also going to be about one woman's quest to learn how to be comfortable being alone. All right. So that's what I mean by the story. And I mean, there's going to be all kinds of adventures that happen here for this narrator. And we want to take the reader through each of those adventures with action-packed material. But we also want to watch the growth of the main character, me in this case, or the narrator, as she does and goes through all of these things. Okay. So I'm hoping that that makes some sense to you at this point. And in your workbook, you've got a blank arc. So you can just work with this here. Work with the beginning on the left-hand side and the end on the right-hand side. And honestly, I think when I coach people one-on-one, this really yields the opportunity to start writing. The next time that you sit down at your writing desk or Starbucks or wherever you go to write, you are going to know at least some of the things that you can start working on. So even before you have all the skills in place, and we'll talk about that in the next video, the skills that you need, you can get started in the writing process. Or perhaps you're someone who's a little ways into the writing process and you've gotten stuck. And typically one of the first reasons that people get stuck is because they don't know where to go next. So this can bring you into a place where you're like, okay, I made it to this point in the story, so what's next? Where do I end? By the way, let me just back up here. There's a third thing. For those of you who are pretty far along in your writing, there's a third thing and a third color that I recommend people pull out and do, where, like, let's say you use green here, and I could do an example of this on my next version, actually, would be a good idea. Go through and write the flashbacks that you might want to put into the scenes. So like, I get off the plane and George is nowhere to be found. I might want to write a flashback about an abandonment in childhood. Okay. So even though the whole story only takes place during the time that this narrator is in Africa, there could be significant chunks of the material that flash back to childhood or, young adulthood or whatever. So I want to just give you some encouragement here. in crafting the what of your material. You know, your life has been however long it's been, 20, 30, 40, 70 years. And, you know, deciding which pieces of one's life go into a memoir, well, it can be a little bit tricky. So just to encourage you, I want to say that you can get behind your story. Know the power of story in general, which we talked about in the last video, and your story in particular to change larger narratives. So what is it that you want to push back against in the culture or in your family or in your own life? And if you are thinking about that question of what you want to push back against, which narratives you'd like to change, that's going to give you some information about what might go in your story. Once you've made that decision, just freaking get behind it, right? This is your story. You get to tell what you want to tell, and you get to leave out what you want to leave out. Think about the personal takeaways. Okay, so think about whatever it is, the trip you took, or your childhood, or your experience of fighting cancer, or you know, some odd person who came into your life that you've always wanted to write about. Think about what you learned. What's the moral of the story? And it might be a little didactic, and you're not going to write it like it's a self-help book, but by asking yourself this question, that will help inform what you put in and what you leave out. And I said this before, but just to reiterate, take a stand for the message that your story carries. Okay? Every one of us in our life, we carry a story of some kind, you know, and this is your chance when writing a memoir to really consciously craft the message of your life, or at least this portion of your life that you're writing about. So again, another great question in determining what to write about or what not to write about is, what kind of stand do you want to take? What are you taking a stand for in this life, or at least in this book? And then be really sure that you're the only one who can tell this story. And here, I actually hear a lot of the authors that I work with hit a point where they say, you know, there's a lot of people writing a story about cancer, or there's a lot of people who've written a story about mental illness. And yeah, there are. But my response is this: there's nobody who can write the story of cancer in conjunction with the story of growing up on Orcas Island, for example. There's no one who can write the story of this, you know, really strange, mysterious person who came into your life at the same time as getting a PhD, right? There are elements that come together which mean that your takeaways are really significantly unique, and you're going to write them in a way that reaches other people. So I really just don't buy it that other people could tell your story. There may be similar messages, but no one can do it exactly the way that you do it, and that's not insignificant. I mean, it really, really isn't. When I wrote Second Wind, there's a lot of other people who've run 7 marathons on 7 continents. It's not as rare as you might think. But what is rare, or what is unique about my story, is that I'm really not an athlete. I mean, you might say I am now because I'm a regular runner, but I'm one of these runners who like chugs along at 12 or 13 minutes a mile. So I have a view from the back of the pack, you know, in this sort of fumbling way that a lot of other people don't have, but a lot of people can relate to, you know. And I really, during the writing of that book, I absolutely embraced one of my favorite quotes by G.K. Chesterton, which is that anything worth doing is worth doing badly. So my perspective: you can't keep a tune, sing. You can't run very well, put one foot in front of the other. It's a really unique perspective, and yet it's totally universal and not all that unusual a message. So, you know, look for the areas where your universal, you know, a lot of people have this story kind of thing come together with, but not in this way. And I think that will help you decide what goes in and what goes out. And I also want to just remind you to know the cost of keeping this story to yourself. Again, Maya Angelou's quote, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." Even if you write this book and you publish it by printing it out, 50 times and handing it out to your family members and, old high school friends, you will have told a story in the way that makes sense to you, and it will no longer be, on your shoulders, in your chest, carried in your back. You won't be somatizing it. And this is the therapist in me speaking, but so often I have people come in and they are carrying some pain in their body. And what we're working on is, what is the story that you need to get out of your body? And so ask yourself that question. If I could get this out, what would be relieved? And that, again, may give you some information about what needs to go into your narrative. So, again, I just want to encourage you. If you're watching this video, you have a story that you want to tell, and it's your unique story. So to get at the what of what goes in and what stays out, I want to just say, and I think I quoted this in the first video as well, but Anne Lamott has this great phrase, write the shitty first draft. Go ahead and write everything. One of my writers that I work with in my group program, Memory into Memoir, she started with 0 words, and at the end of 9 months ended up with about 148,000 words. Guess what? That's too many words. Well, it wouldn't be if they were all the right words, but they're not. And yet, in the midst of that 148,000 words, there's a lot of really great writing. So now she's going to go through and she's going to cull. She's going to pull out what doesn't go in there. You don't have to know it all from the upfront. The reason I give you the arc is because with the arc, you can get started in generating the scenes. But you can generate as much as you want, and it doesn't have to be perfect. You can go back through and generate more later or take some out. So here's my final encouragement. Sit down with the activity in the workbook, work through the arc timeline exercise, and then don't forget that you have a coaching call with me with this package. So you can just send me an email if you want to at clostman@live.com, or you can jump on my website at camiostman.net, and there's a little pop-up that comes up on the bottom right-hand part of the screen, and my schedule's on there, and you can schedule with me. Once you've done your arc outline, let's get in touch and have a chat, all right? Let's get you going on the material. So in the next video, we're going to be talking about the how. Great, you know what you're writing, you know what your story is, you feel encouraged, you know why it's important for you to write your story. So how? What's the schedule that's going to get it done? What are the skills that you're going to need? We're going to take a look at all of this in the next video. So until then, see you soon.